Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Distinguished Professor Lecture Series 2021, The Concept of Being Human in the Age of Digital Technology of the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies. My name is Liang. I'm Assistant Professor of China Graduate School of Theology and a Special Researcher of the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be the moderator for today's lecture by Professor Thomas Fuchs, Beyond the Human, a critic of transhumanism. In recent years, as some of you will know, the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies has increasingly focused on interdisciplinary research and initiated from 2017 to 2021, 5 research projects: Dignity, Morality, and Rights 2017, Risk and Hope 2018, Trust 2019, Hospitality and Autonomy 2020, Body and Bodilessness 2021. In connection with the current research project, Body and Bodilessness, we have invited 3 eminent professors to present their research on anthropological issues in the age of digital technology. We hope that they shed light on these complex issues and help us to think about the meaning of being human in this rapidly changing age. It's a privilege for me to introduce Professor Thomas Fuchs, our speaker today. Professor Thomas Fuchs is one of today's world-famous phenomenologists. He serves as Karl Jaspers Professor for the Philosophical Foundations of Psychiatry, as well as head of section Phenomenological Psychopathology and Psychotherapy at the Psychiatric Department of Heidelberg University. His research focuses on phenomenological anthropology and psychopathology, as well as theory and ethics in psychiatry and neurosciences. As one of the leading philosophers of our present, Professor Fuchs has published more than 10 monographs. His new book, In This Year, In Defense of Human Being, Fundamental Questions of an Embodied Anthropology, has been just published by Oxford University Press. Professor Fuchs has coordinated, as a passionate scholar, many interdisciplinary research projects, such as the Marsilius Project Embodiment as a Paradigm of a New Evolutionary Cultural Anthropology, 2013 to 2016, and the European Marine Corps Research Training Networks, Disorder and Coherence of the Embodied Self, 2007 to 2011, and Towards Embodied Science of Intersubjectivity, 2012 to 2016, and the Joint National Research Project, The Brain as an Organ of Interrelations, 2008 to 2011. We are very much looking forward to today's lecture, Beyond the Human, a critic of transhumanism, a hot topic in the present. I should not forget to mention that our scholars of the current research project, Body and Bodilessness, 6 Chinese university professors of different specialties, such as philosophy, literature, Old Testament, and law, etc., will join us today. At the end of lecture, we will facilitate a time of question and answer, about 30 minutes. Please feel free and be prepared to raise your questions if you are interested in this lecture. Just click the Q&A button and type your questions in English and Chinese, better in English. As a moderator, I was predestined to raise the first question to open our Q&A session. Professor Fuchs, the floor is yours.
So here's the title once more, Beyond the Human, a critique of transhumanism. I hope it's good to understand. Everything fine if I talk like this?
Yeah.
Okay, fine.
It's fine, yeah.
Okay, so I start with a quotation by Fyodor Dostoevsky, which runs as follows. We are oppressed at being men with a real individual body and blood. We are ashamed of it. We think it a disgrace and try to contrive to be some sort of impossible generalized man. Soon we shall contrive to be born somehow from an idea. Now, this quotation from Dostoevsky seems prophetic. Being an ordinary person made of flesh and blood becomes more and more a defect. In the face of our machines, we begin to be ashamed of our own imperfection. This seems to announce a fundamental transformation of the previous image of the human, characterized by the following features. Human nature can no longer be considered as a set constant. Evolution is understood as a process of optimization of life, but its outcome seems to be contingent each point in time. So human nature seems to be changeable and accessible to our self-forming. Second, human nature is in every sense to be in need of enhancement, it seems. We should assume the responsibility for our further development ourselves, rather than, as until now, leave it to blind evolution and chance. So the outcome of evolution, at least to transhumanists, seems to be only a badly constructed, a fallible product which has grown blindly. And above all, our bodies are fragile, vulnerable, subjugated by age and frail. Mortality is the greatest imposition that nature has in store for us. So dependence on bodily conditions appears to be ever less acceptable, and overcoming it becomes the climax of the emancipatory project of modernity. So what is propagated to this end are various forms of optimization and upgrading of the body, technologies of remodeling human nature, and even overcoming death. For the last 2 or 3 decades, such ideas have found increasing prevalence under the term of transhumanism. Transhumanists see the opportunity to optimize inadequate human nature by bio, nano, and computer technologies. Each person should have the right to define and expand his psychic or physical abilities, his sex, his appearance, or his intelligence, according to his will. Transhumanists such as Hans Moravec, Ray Kurzweil, Nick Bostrom, and others predict even that we will see the fusion of man and machine. Cyborgs should form the next stage of evolution and lead us towards summits of intelligence and life expectancy that are unimaginable today. Such utopias find philosophical support in functionalist theories, according to which the human mind ultimately exists as an informational and data structure. Information is, however, in principle transferable and is not bound to a particular bodily basis. Information not only uses the brain as a substrate, but could also use external prostheses, memory storages, computer systems. Humans are therefore, in the words of the philosopher Andy Clark, natural-born cyborgs. And there seems nothing contradictory in the mixture of technology, brain, and body, because the mind itself is already thought of as an analogy of a technical system. As the transhumanist Nick Bostrom writes, various pharmacological, genetic, or digital techniques of enhancement may make us, or our descendants, post-human beings who may have indefinite health spans, much greater intellectual faculties than any current human being, and perhaps entirely new sensibilities or modalities, as well as the ability to control their own emotions. Such promises extend to the idea of transferring one's mind to another substrate in the form of pure information, what is also called mind uploading. So we could connect our brain to a computer do away with our old body, and finally attain to digital immortality. I quote Ray Kurzweil, "Up until now, our mortality was tied to the longevity of our hardware. When the hardware crashed, that was it. And as we cross the divide to instantiate ourselves into our computational technology, our identity will be based on our evolving mind file. We will be software, not hardware." And with this, transhumanism radicalizes the view of the human body, which is widespread in both the life sciences and the humanities, namely the concept of the body as an objectifiable vehicle, an apparatus that is external to ourselves. And this mechanistic view of the body is the counterpart of the functionalist view of the mind as pure information or software. Thus, transhumanism is based on a radical dualism of body and mind. What it wholly misses, however, is the fundamental structure of human existence, namely vitality and embodiment. Humans, which I will argue in the following, are neither biological machines nor pure minds, but they are first and foremost living bodily beings. Being bodily is not something external to us, but is rather the foundation of our existence. Precisely because all feeling, perception, thought, and action is a form of our embodied enactment of life. At the same time, of course, humans are beings with the ability to take a stance towards their own embodiment. That means they are beings that may form an instrumental relationship with their body. But they can therefore neither ignore their embodiment nor do away with it. Rather, they must form, cultivate, and integrate it into their ideas of a good life. A defense of embodied human nature certainly demands a far more extensive discussion than is possible for me in this context, in this lecture. So of the manifold proposals and visions of human optimization, I single out one of the most prominent, namely the idea of mind uploading or digital immortality. This vision is particularly suitable for illustrating and refuting transhumanism's neo-Gnostic image of humanity. So what is mind uploading? In short, it means detaching consciousness from the biological organism and transferring it to a digital system. So the basic idea is to take a particular brain, scan its structure in detail, and construct a software model of it that is so faithful to the original that when run on appropriate hardware, it will behave in essentially the same way as the original brain. If successful, the procedure would lead to a qualitative reproduction of the original mind with memory and personality intact onto a computer where it would now exist as software. This is the idea of Sandberg and Bostrom. And this digital intelligence would then occupy a cyborg or an android, or it could even live in virtual reality, becoming in principle immortal. In support of this, transhumanists usually point to the possibility of connecting the brain to microchips, the signals of which feed into the neural network. And this would not only further our abilities to an unprecedented scale, but it would also gradually outsource consciousness to external structures. Of course, all this is far from realization, and it is indeed highly questionable whether connecting the brain to an electronic data storage is even possible. Present brain-computer interfaces work only through very global recording of brain activity through EEG or electrodes in the skull. The signal patterns are processed by computers and may enable the subjects to direct a cursor on a screen or to work with a robot arm by means of mere imagining of movement. However, the reverse direction, so the transfer of specific signal patterns into the brain, is completely impossible so far. And so also in future, we will continue to acquire foreign languages only through learning and practice, and not through ordering a program from Amazon and downloading it onto our brain. It is adventurous enough to meditate on the thought that we could scan or copy the structure of the brain with its over 100 billion neurons and multiple hundreds of trillions of synapses. This thought becomes fantastic, however, if one considers that indeed we need to capture not only the structure, but also the entire continuously variable activity of the system as a whole, right up to the transmitter release in every individual synapse. And here it is hard to say what could even be scanned. The firing of neurons may to some extent still be presented as digitalizable information. So on and off equals 0 and 1. But this is only the tip of the iceberg. In all processes below this level, there are molecular and atomic processes with quantum physical fuzziness, which are also in constant flux. So taken all this together, one could just as well try to copy a waterfall. But let us leave this technical objection aside. Let us look to the foundational idea of mind uploading. Obviously, we are dealing with a peculiar amalgam of materialism and idealism, a particular mixture of both. On the one hand, consciousness is reduced to the neural processes of the brain and thereby materialized. On the other hand, it is considered as pure form of this process, namely as a pattern of information, which can in principle be completely detached from the substrate and be transferred to other systems. And this functionalism is nothing other than an idealism of information, the mind considered as pure form. However, both assumptions, the materialistic and the idealistic assumption, are equally blind to the vital reality of the embodied person. So in the following, I criticize first the functionalist and second, the neuro-reductionist prerequisite of mind uploading. Let me see if I can oh, sorry, I have to my video again. My video has been lost now. Just for a moment, I have to stop the screen sharing. Okay,
it's good. Yeah.
Then video freezes at times, so I try to make it work again. Okay, then we can continue. To start with the critique of functionalism. The idea of mind uploading equates the mind with the totality of algorithms in a complex system such as the brain. In other words, it considers the mind as software. And this corresponds to the common concept of cognitive science, as well as artificial intelligence, namely functionalism. And here, mental states, feelings, perceptions, thoughts, and wishes are defined through functional connections of the input and the output of a system. So someone who stabs his finger, for example, enters a mental state which leads to moaning and withdrawal of the finger. So pain is nothing other than the state of the brain which results in this output. And this state can be described as a certain amount of data. Consciousness is thus the byproduct of a neural calculation of an algorithm. A basic principle of functionalism is substrate independence. If the mind is made up of algorithms, then it can run as software on every sufficiently complex hardware, whether it be composed of carbon or silicon, of neurons or of transistors and circuits. And this is because it is always only algorithms and information which make up the mind. Nothing material, nothing bodily, nothing vital. The progress of artificial intelligence has given functionalism an enormous boost. The power of human intelligence does not seem to be bound to the brain, let alone to consciousness. Of course, no artificial system has the faintest idea of what it does, of what it calculates. Obviously, the decisive feature of pain, of feeling, of thought is lost in the functionalist concept, and that is experience. The classic Chinese room argument of Chun Searle still remains relevant. Even an artificial system that could translate Chinese perfectly and could find the matching answers to all questions in Chinese according to its program, such a system still does not understand a single word of Chinese. Meaning, understanding cannot be reduced to functional algorithms if there is no conscious subject who understands what the algorithms mean. The same applies to pain, however, to the taste of chocolate, to the scent of lavender. No qualitative experience as such can be derived from that data and information. Consciousness is not the mindless traversal of data, of states of data at all. At core, consciousness is self-awareness. It is for me that I feel pain, that I perceive, that I understand or think. And this self-awareness is not based on reflection, nor is it composed of intentional contents or information. Rather, it has already characterized primary experience, such as when I comfortably, thoughtlessly doze in the warming sun. That means it is a basal sense of self that forms the background to all of our experiences, a feeling of being alive that springs from our embodiment and which manifests itself in well-being or ill-being, specifically in hunger, thirst, pain, or pleasure. There is nothing to suggest that this vital sense of self can be reproduced in digital algorithms. Let us take the example of pain. The unpleasurable quality, the painful element of pain, cannot be expressed neither digitally in zeros or ones, nor physically, for example, in negative charges. And this is because the difference between 0 and 1, or between plus and minus, only seemingly expresses a difference in value. In fact, this difference is only a convention. It doesn't imply anything really negative, anything painful, in the sense of a negative experience, of a painful value. All digital signs or physical states are themselves only pure facticity, pure externality, and there is nothing to suggest that a system which runs them could experience something like pain. The same applies for all striving, for all being after something and being ahead of oneself, which distinguishes conscious life. Artificial systems only go through states. They are not ahead of themselves, and they don't care for anything at all. Take the example of a cruise missile. A cruise missile is equipped with a goal detecting program that is able to modify the course of the missile according to a forward mechanism that minimizes the deviation of the missile from the goal. Of course, the missile doesn't seek or discover anything. Each correction serves only the internal set point regulation of the mechanism and happens purely momentarily, without referring in any way to a set goal in the future. For this goal itself, for the future as such, the mechanism remains blind and deaf. In other words, the effective core of consciousness, which makes us feeling and wishing beings in the first place, cannot be grasped by information theory. It is inseparably bound to our corporeal sensing and therefore also to our biological existence. That which is comfortable or which is painful, which is good or bad, cannot be expressed in an algorithm. Digital information carries no values. And whatever we take from the human brain in terms of data or information, in order to copy it to an artificial system of processors and circuits, the outcome would only ever be sheer externality. An android or a cyborg programmed with such data would in the best case be an unfeeling zombie. While I think immortality is generally conceived a little differently. The idea of mind uploading becomes completely absurd if one thinks of the possibility of a multiple copy. Imagine a perfect digital reduplication of my brain in whatever substrate would per impossibile actually restore my subjective experience. Let us just imagine that for a moment. If this were the case, then the process could be repeated. I could be replicated twice or 3 times or more. Now, in which of these clones would my original first-person experience be located? Each duplicate would claim to be me, would remember my life, would continue my identity. Who among them would be my real successor? Well, of course, I do not want to further pursue such abstruse thoughts. At the latest here, it becomes obvious that the idea of using the brain as a blueprint for immortality has nothing to do with reality. Rather, it has much more to do with a naive belief in the computer model of the mind. The human person is not a sum of data that may be copied, not a digital program, but rather a living and experiencing being. Now, as I said, the second prerequisite of mind uploading is the identification of brain and person. In a typical formulation, all that makes up a person, such as their mind, their consciousness, emotions, memories, their identity, is physically saved in the structure and the processes of the brain. This neuroreductionist view, which is widespread today, is crystallized in the thought experiment of the brain in a vat. A brain removed from the body by a fictive neuroscientist could be kept alive in a nutrient solution, and could be fed appropriate information from a supercomputer, such that the brain could produce the same experience, the same world, the same self as it does allegedly produce now. We wouldn't notice the difference. And this is, so runs the argument, because our experience is nothing other than a data structure in the brain itself, no matter where the brain is fed from. However, the brain is not a closed system which only receives input and issues output. It is much rather continuously engaged in feedback information with the body and with the environment. And it is only through this constant interaction that conscious experience comes about. This is the core tenet, the core idea of the paradigm of embodied cognition. Embodied cognition regards consciousness and subjectivity as essentially embodied in the whole organism and as situated, enacted through the constant sensorimotor interaction of organism and environment. In this way, the mind is not regarded as an inner model of the world produced inside the brain, but as a particular enactment of the life of the organism as a whole. I have already mentioned our primary, still unreflected experience, the vital sense of self. Sorry, I missed these words here, so you can repeat them. Consciousness and subjectivity are embodied and they are situated and enacted. I've already mentioned the primary, still unreflected experience, the vital sense of self. And this doesn't arise first in the cortex, but emerges from continuous vital regulatory processes involving the whole organism, which are integrated in the brainstem and higher brain centers. The maintenance of homeostasis, so the maintenance of the inner environment and thus the viability of the organism, the maintenance of homeostasis is the primary function of consciousness, and it manifests itself in desire, hunger, thirst, pain, or pleasure. This can also be experienced in the way all experience is a form of life. In German, we would say Leben and Erleben, where Erleben means life coming to itself, coming to awareness. So without life, there is no consciousness and no thought. One could argue against this, that vital processes need only be represented in the brain in order to be experienced. Then they wouldn't be constitutive for consciousness. However, the integration which underlies conscious experience is based on a continuous circular feedback between the basal areas of the brain and the body. And these interactive cycles do not permit to separate representations from the represented. Neuroscientist Antonio Damasio, who explored this interaction between brain and body in every detail, Damasio even speaks of a looped circuit where the body communicates to the central nervous system and the latter responds to the body's messages. The signals are not separable from the organism states where they originate. The ensemble constitutes a dynamic bonded unit. This unit enacts a functional fusion of body states and perceptual states, such that the dividing line between the two can no longer be drawn. The signals conveyed would not be about the state of flesh, but would be literally extensions of the flesh. The integration which corresponds to conscious experience is therefore not an image in the brain, but it always includes the organism itself. As conscious beings, we are embodied beings. There is no separation of images of the body in the brain. In the same way, emotions are also bound to the constant interaction of brain and body. Our moods, our feelings always include the whole body experience. Not only the brain, but also the autonomous nervous system, the beating of the heart, the activity of the circulation, breathing, our muscle actions, facial expressions, gestures, and the whole body stance. So every emotional experience is inseparably bound to changes in the bodily landscape. And the same is true for all our perceptions and actions, which result from the sensory-motor interaction of brain, organism, and environment. So from functional loops involving our senses, our limbs, and equally things and other people. The brain is certainly capable of integrating all of the organismic functions, but it is in turn reliant upon them. The brain is not a command center which receives information and gives out orders, but it is rather a resonance organ or a relational organ, a part of the functional whole of body and environment. It is easy to see that the brain in that thought experiment fails. Even an extremely complex computer could never simulate the homeostatic self-regulation of the whole organism. It could never simulate all of the interconnections of neural, neuroendocrine, and humoral processes that involve the whole body. These processes are of a biological, a biochemical nature. They cannot be represented in digital information. Nor could a computer simulate all of the circular interactions between brain, the body, and the environment, those things on which our experience and action in the world are based. Conscious experience presupposes embodiment, corporeality, and thus biological processes in a living body. Nothing of this is found in mind uploading. A disembodied brain is as much of a functionalist fiction as mind uploading. Against such a cerebrocentrism, we can set the paradigm of embodiment. Consciousness is based on the continuous interaction between brain, body, and environment. And therefore, it cannot be considered localizable at all, neither as an internal state in the skull, nor as a data pattern in the brain. It is the overarching activity of a living being in its relationship with the environment. Or in other words, to put it simply, it is always humans who feel, perceive, think, and act, not their brains. Let me once again turn to the basic idea of mind uploading. I think it's clearer now that behind the transhumanistic vision, there stands a concept of humanity which is reductionist and at the same time dualistic. The idea of the fusion of mind and technology is an expression of the neglect, even the contempt for life and the living body. Freeing the mind from the material body, this is the solution that the present techno-utopianists set before us. Ultimately, they are the secular epigones of the Neoplatonic and Gnostic teachings about the body as a grave, about the body as a dungeon of the soul. The Gnostics in late antiquity saw in the arbitrary creation of the world and of man a descent from primordial divine light. In terrestrial life, the pure soul of man, the pneuma, becomes connected to the dark and foreign matter of the body, thereby becoming impure. Now, when the spirit frees itself from the body again through purification and asceticism, then he can finally return to the sphere of light and divinity. Of course, from a transhumanist perspective, the pure mind exists not any longer as a pneuma, but rather as a data structure or information. And as pure form, as substrate-independent structure, it should be detachable from the body and transferable to another substrate. This functionalist thinking sharply separates the essence of the mind consisting of information from its existence, which it assigns it assigns priority to the essence, to the information. However, this pure information misses the decisive element of existence, and this is concrete individuality. Information is freely convertible and transferable, but it is precisely this advantage that has its fatal defect. Information knows no individual perspective, no place from which the world could appear to a subject. This place of concrete individuation is nothing other than the living body. Transhumanists want, as Dostoevsky writes, to be born somehow from an idea. But the idealism of information is sterile. Mathematics or informatics does not produce humans. The mind does not exist in a pure form, but rather in the concrete being of individual existence, and this individualization requires a body. The mind is bodily, the mind is vital, and it cannot survive in the dead algorithms and circuits of a computer. Only as bodily feelings do we also feel and know what is comfortable and what is uncomfortable, what is pleasure and what is pain, what is good and what is bad. And it is only the bodily being in the world that makes possible the freedom which we possess in the terrestrial world. And this is because the body is the medium of our enactment of life, of all our feeling, thinking, and acting. Transhumanists see our freedom differently. In their view, the mind must be freed because we are only contingently trapped in mortal vehicles, in mortal bodies. Against this, we can set the concept of embodiment. Embodiment means that bodies are not prisons and minds are not angels, but rather that both are indissolubly entangled, enmeshed in one another. The mind can never be removed from the body and transferred to a computer. Our conscious experience is based on the body, a body which we are. And this embodied, and therefore, of course, mortal individuation is the price we must pay in order to experience the possibilities and the freedom of existence on Earth. Let me sum up so far. Being a human of real flesh and blood seems more and more troublesome to us, as Dostoevsky said. And this hostility towards the flesh today finds its expression in the functionalist cybernetic paradigm. Humans, it says, are information processing machines. Their consciousness and their personality exist as immaterial programs. Progress consists, in this view, in updating the deficient body by means of information and biotechnologies, and finally, converting it into a synthetic product. But our embodiment sets an unsurmountable border for all functionalist utopias. A being of flesh and blood is not representable in algorithms. And insofar as our conscious experience is embodied, it also cannot be simulated, copied, or transferred in the form of information. All experience is a form of life. Radical transhumanist utopias fail because of their complete misunderstanding of what it is that life is. Now, the fact that corporeality and embodiment are constitutive for our experience does not as such establish that human nature cannot be changed. Just as we medically intervene in our bodies, we cannot categorically rule out interventions into our nature. And that is the topic of my second part of the lecture. Just as we medically intervene in our bodies, we cannot categorically rule out interventions into our nature. Mind uploading, digital immortality will remain forever a utopia, but the insight into the constitutive embodiment of our existence may also shed light on less radical demands for enhancement and optimization. And that's what I'm turning to now. And here it can be shown that the idea of optimization meets inherent contradictions, because shifting or displacing the proportions of human capabilities which have been built up in the course of evolution always comes at a high price. And this is because these natural capabilities always represent meaningful compromises which have resulted from the conflicting demands made by a complex creature like the human in a variable environment. Without going too much into detail, I would like to name 3 examples for this. Let us think of the general enhancement of our powers of attention, which could be achieved by psychostimulants or transmagnetic brain stimulation. On the first view, it seems to be an advantage if we are dealing with the speed of learning or efficiency. But attention is a precious gift, and many stimuli and possible objects compete for it. An excessive focusing of attention can lead to the exclusion of other objects, which may also be possibly useful. Patients which take Ritalin, a psychostimulant, and which is a psychostimulant which is used to treat attention deficit disorder. Patients taking this substance report that the increased fixation on a task renders everything else secondary. So the cognitive focusing increases, but the needs, for example, for interpersonal relationships to others is decreased. And the interest in new experiences and spontaneity and creativity are reduced. So this means that a general enhancement of human attention would come at the price of a loss, namely of openness, flexibility, and receptivity for novelty. And thus, with this enhancement, we are faced with a typical conflict of optimization. We would increase our attention, but at the price of losing our openness. And this is true for every other possible enhancements. Let's take the power of memory and their possible increase. The ability to remember much or everything seems evidently to be a win, and in many ways it is. But someone who memorizes, who recollects everything, can no longer forget anything. Forgetting relieves us from an overflow of details, so that the significant memories can emerge. And it is also only forgetting that allows us to neutralize the effect of the past, an effect that would otherwise only ever grow in life. The past would grow and become dominant in our life. Only through forgetting does the mind hold the possibility of renewal, the ability to see the world with fresh eyes. Individuals with hypomnesia, and that's a rare condition where you can't forget anything, these individuals suffer the torment of no longer being able to forget. They are exposed to a constant crossfire of irrelevant memories, which they can hardly suppress. So it is precisely characteristic of our memory that it establishes a balance between remembering and forgetting. And finally, let us look at the enhancement of mood. Well, one could say people want to boost their happiness by pharmacological or technical means. And so what is the problem? In the view of the hardship and manifold frustrations of life, this is all too understandable. However, well-being, satisfaction, and happiness are the reward which nature holds in stock for us as a reward for the gain, as for the effort and for the toil that we invested. And usually this reward is in proportion to the expense that we have invested. So mountaineers, people who climb mountains, know the different experience of happiness depending on whether they have climbed a mountain themselves or whether they have just been carried up by a cable car. Now, if well-being and happiness would be kept on a constant high level for free, as it were, then the human striving for self-development and self-transcendence would weaken. Moreover, the experience of happiness itself would flatten out, since it would come about undeservedly and not as a satisfying result of one's effort. At the same time, our tolerance for frustration would diminish, because overcoming resistances would no longer be trained to the same degree. All this resembles the changes which we may observe as psychiatrists in drug addicts in the long term. We could also think of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where the general intake of the mood-enhancing drug soma, as it is called, serves to provide a flat pleasure to the population and at the same time a sedation. Such an enhancement seems hardly desirable, and even then when it were a voluntary measure and not decreed by the state, as in Brave New World. Now, I think these three examples should suffice to show that a remodeling of human nature is always accompanied by a high price, and the price must be paid with the same coin that we have seemingly just won. This applies also to the ultimate transhumanist vision, namely immortality. The prospect that nothing is final any longer, that everything will be repeated forever, would rob humanity of all the treasure that it possesses in the unique, irreplaceable, mortal life. In Jorge Luis Borges' story, The Immortal, the voyage to the immortal troglodytes leads the narrator to recognize that endless life means paralyzation by the eternal recurrence of the same. I quote from this story, Everything among the mortals has the value of the irretrievable and the perilous. Among the immortals, on the other hand, every act is the echo of others that preceded it in the past, with no visible beginning, or it is the faithful presage of others that in the future will repeat to a vertiginous degree. Nothing can happen only once. Nothing is precariously precarious. So the experience of bliss, of intense pleasure, and the experience of presence would flatten out, because the colors of life only shine on the dark background of death. Moreover, each prolongation of life, even more the immortality, would abolish the balance between the generations to the disadvantage of the descendants. In order to avoid overpopulation, the immortality of those living would be bought with the necessary prevention of new life. We would have to renounce of always beginning again with youth and renewal. Defying death, humanity would always further age and age, solidifying in current life forms, and it would finally, in the ever more in the repetition of the same, succumb to an all overshadowing tiredness. To conclude, the vision of transhumanism seems to be a blissful vision, but it is nothing more than a dystopia. Transhumanism ignores the fundamentally antinomic structure of our existence, which as an embodied and earthly existence is necessarily characterized by polar terms. Transhumanists want to get rid of those polarities and contradictions. They think that there could be something like a pure mind, pure happiness, pure knowledge, or pure life. However, just as the mind may not be separated from the body, thus pleasure may not be divorced and separated from pain. Liberty may not be divorced and separated from restriction. Life may not be separated from death. There's a nice passage in the foreword of Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason. I quote, "The light dove, in free flight cutting through the air, the resistance of which it feels, could get the idea that it could do even better in airless space. But obviously, even birds need the resistance of air for their free flight, because movement is something bodily, and therefore it is subject to the polarity of embodied existence." Similarly, Kant goes on to argue a philosopher who would only dwell in the realm of pure ideas would only arrive at fruitless thoughts and figments of his imagination. So mind needs resistance too. And therefore we cannot keep one of the poles of existence and get rid of the other. Indeed, even shifting the balance between them may have serious consequences, for it is characteristic of all naturally evolved polarities that they permit for a high degree of variation and adaptivity. Through biologically shifting our capacities towards one pole, we would lose this adaptivity. The idea of enhancement and optimization thus meets inherent contradictions. In the last analysis, the perfection of humanity can only be approached in a cultural and ethical sense, as Enlightenment had actually intended. However, with the failure of the great utopias of the 20th century, and with the improvement of medical and digital technologies, the idea has spread of producing earthly happiness in a more banal, in a technical way. The idea of immediately transforming man into a happy, possibly immortal being. Transhumanist utopias no longer wish to recognize the conditio humana, the human condition, and no longer wish to accept the limitations and contradictions of human nature. One of the founders of transhumanism, Robert Ettinger, formulated this program in its full radicalness. Thus, humanity itself is a disease of which we must now proceed to cure ourselves. To do this, it must first be shown that Homo sapiens is only a botched beginning. When he clearly sees himself as an error, he may not only be motivated to sculpt himself, but to make at least a few swift and confident strokes. Yet the abolition of man by man is an absurd undertaking. It is absurd because it is precisely the bodily, affective conditions of our existence which give us the primary values. And these conditions are birth, hunger, thirst, pain, desire, and death. They show us that life is better than not life. Nutrition is better than hunger. Proximity to others is better than rejection. Love better than hate. So this should not be, and that is good. We find the primary good because it is already inherent in our lives. We do not choose it at our will. So without anchoring our wishes and values in human nature, we would therefore lose the basic orientation between the good and the bad, and the basic orientation which lends meaning and sense to our lives. We could declare anything good and bad, as we could no longer say what the good really is. And therefore, the very concept of optimization would be rendered meaningless. There would be no longer an Archimedean point to which one could attach the post-human world. To conclude, what we need today is a defense of the human being. It is necessary to defend our embodiment, our bodily nature, against their devaluation, their enhancement, their overcoming. Our embodiment does not pretend to tell us what exactly the good life looks like. It does, however, give us much better clues as to what this might be than any technically induced happiness. Let us therefore be satisfied with the human condition and its unavoidable imperfection. It may not be the best, but it is certainly not the worst thing that could have happened to us. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Fuchs, for this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Professor Fuchs has presented us a very interesting and important lecture on the relevance of the ongoing interdisciplinary studies of the embodiment of brain for various current hot topics like mind uploading, human enhancement. I found his considerations very stimulating and very enlightening. To summarize the lecture, Professor Fuchs argues from the perspective of the embodiment of brain and embodiment of a cognition against the transhumanist movement, which assumes radically or dualistic and functional and a neuro-reductional view of brain and mind, insisting rather that the process of mind always involves the whole body. As bodily being, we keep alive in the interaction between the mind, the body, and the environment. Based on this concept, Professor Fuchs criticized the radical idea of mind uploading or digital immortality as dangerous neurognostic image of humanity on the one side, and the less radical idea of human enhancement and optimization as rejection of the corporeal effective conditions of our real existence on the other side. One of the inspirations of Professor Fuchs' lecture was for me to think about the so-called distinguishing between spirits of St. Paul, which he mentioned in his letters to the Corinthians. A current task of the theology with regard to pneumatology is perhaps also to uncover the functional reduction of the human spirit and divine spirit to informational and data structure, which you have mentioned in your lecture. Both spirits connected and different presuppose corporeality because they both are living spirit. In contrast to information theory or cybernetics, we have to provide a different definition of vitality of spirit.
Yeah.
My question is, relates to your quote at the beginning from Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. Is my favorite writers. And about the function of literature in general. As we all know, science fiction literature and science fiction movies play a very important role in current discourses on transhumanism and posthumanism. How should we properly assess the role of science fiction literature, science fiction movies, or the literary imagination in general in our research on transhumanism and posthumanism? Are they to be named as knowledge or better ideology? That is my question.
Yes, thank you very much for this interesting question. To go back to Dostoevsky, it seems really prophetic and amazing how he anticipated our stance towards our body, and in the age of increasing technology already foresaw the increasing devaluation of the body, thinking it that we start to think it as a disgrace to be embodied mortal beings. So that is certainly astonishing, and illustrates the power of literature, of writers, to imagine and to foresee, to anticipate possible developments, even sometimes decades ago. On the other hand, science fiction provides thought experiments that may help us to imagine the possible dangers of technologies that we are currently developing. Let me take the example of the science fiction movie Her, which might be known to some of you. So in this science fiction movie, the protagonist falls in love with a computer system called Samantha, which is only a system, but a learning system that increasingly starts to answer in a completely understanding and loving way. So it has only a female voice, nothing else, nothing corporeal. But this already suffices to make the protagonist fall in love with her or with it. Difficult to say whether it's whether we should call it a woman, because it's obviously not an embodied person. But the human voice that it has is stunningly convincing, and this already suffices to make the protagonist fall in love with her, although he knows that it is only a system. There is nothing on the other side, so to speak. There's no one on the other side, so to speak. And this is played through in the movie by Spike Jonze called Her. I think it's 10 years ago now. And it's clear that we see in this science fiction a possibility that we are faced now in our everyday dealings already with Alexa or other simulations of minds, and we will increasingly be dealing with such simulations, and we will be increasingly seduced in losing our capacity to distinguish between simulation and reality, between a real encounter, between a real counterpart and only a simulation of a mindful being. I think this example shows nicely that in dealing with new technologies, we can use the power of imagination that is invested in science fiction literature and science fiction movies in order to better understand the possibilities, but also the possible risks of certain developments that are so new, that are so novel for us, that we do not really understand what they mean. On the other hand, a final sentence, some of the science fiction movies and some of the science fiction literature can also be misleading because they create the impression that, for example, mind loading or switching persons between bodies would be something possible. Many science fiction movies just assume that this is a future possibility that will be realized in the next decades. And here there are, as I have said, there are principal impossibilities, so to speak, and so it's in principle impossible for mind uploading to be realized. And here science fiction movies also have the danger of creating the imagination or the suggestion that certain technological possibilities are just ahead of us, and it is not, and that is of course misleading. So we have to distinguish here between a positive function of imagination in science fiction on the one hand, and a misleading or confusing effect on the other hand.
Yeah, thank you very much for your answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, we have got many questions. Can you see these questions from your computer? Yeah, you can pick up the questions as you wish.
I'm looking for the chat.
Yeah.
Right now, just a moment.
Yes, I saw.
Oh yeah, it's in the question and answer. Yeah. Okay, I thought it is in the chat.
Yeah.
No, it's not in the chat. Okay, I take one of those. Let me see. I take the first one. The question is, will humans evolve toward a direction that separates physical body and consciousness? If not, is evolution based inherently on the inseparability between the two, such that with evolving organs we can become more adaptable and intelligent? Well, my answer would simply be this is not possible. The physical body may not be separated from consciousness, or consciousness not separated from the physical body, because it is precisely a function, an activity of the whole body in context with the environment. As I've shown or tried to show, that is not the brain or an information or a data structure as such that is the sufficient basis for consciousness, but it is the living organism as maintaining a certain inner equilibrium, a certain inner steady state, because it has to sustain itself, to maintain its homeostasis. It needs exchange with the environment. So metabolism is the basic process that is the process of life. Life starts with separating from the environment, but at the same time it needs an exchange with the environment. So the living organism is in constant flux with exchange via the exchange. And the function of primary consciousness is now precisely to regulate this inner equilibrium. And therefore we need the basic feelings of pleasure and displeasure, of hunger and thirst, of being in a certain mood, of elation or depression. All this regulates our inner state. Now, this inner state is not something, obviously, not something that is a state of the brain. It's a state of the organism, and the brain only serves as an integrating organ for integrating the whole state of the body. But without a bodily being, without exchange with the environment, without metabolism, there would be no basis for consciousness. So consciousness is not something like intellectual, symbolic thinking, what we're doing right now when talking with each other, but much more basically, it's well, we can do without intellectual thinking. Obviously, I've tried to give the example of just dozing in the warm sun. And you give up intellectual thought, and symbolic thought is not necessary for living. But what is necessary is this basic feeling of being alive. And this is not something symbolic, something intentional, but it is something based on the organism, on the whole organism. And therefore, a separation between the physical or organic body and consciousness is in principle not possible. If evolution is based on this inseparability, well, of course, still organs can evolve further. Human evolution has been an adaptation to certain environments and has been an adaptation towards increasing the viability of human life. And no question, humans have become more intelligent over the last 100,000 years, but it has always been based and remained embodied intelligence and not something like a pure mind. So that would be the answer to this first question. Should I take one of the other ones, or okay?
Yeah, we have many times.
If consciousness is the matter of body, does it mean that if we add more feedback loops between a robot and the environment, we can make them, we can make an artificial consciousness? Yeah, that is frequently heard and frequently believed assumption. We just need more feedback loops. So robots obviously have already a number of feedback loops, which enable them to register their position vis-a-vis certain environmental objects, and to adapt to the change, also to changing environments. Even there are spiders who can adapt to having one. So robot spiders who can adapt to having one leg being torn out, so that they are no longer walking on 6 legs, but on 5 legs now. And they can readapt to this new situation of their body, so to speak, by modifying their program. So all this simulates, of course, evolutionary adaptation, but it is not enough to create consciousness. For the same reason I just pointed out, the feedback loop of a sensory motor feedback loop, as such, is not enough to create consciousness. Consciousness is based on a vital sphere of the organism, as I said, on metabolism and inner homeostasis, and all the processes that are complex, analogous, humoral and neuroendocrine and biochemical processes. All this does not at all happen in a computer. A computer doesn't have a biochemistry, and even his command center is not a brain. There are so many differences between the living brain being connected to the body on the one hand, and a command center, so a software center in the robot, that these cannot simply be compared with each other. It's something completely different. So the adding of a feedback loop does not change the fact that it is not a living organism and that it is not an embodied consciousness that robots can realize. It's not the feedback loop. It's something deeper, something more vital, something more physical, something more biochemical. So you see, my idea of consciousness is a very physical one. Consciousness is not something purely mental or purely symbolic. As you sit wherever you are, sit on your chairs, look at the screen, interact with me, hear my words. This is all on a very high level, but where you sit, how you feel your background, bodily experience, that is what consciousness consists in. And you can do away with most feedback loops of speaking, of looking at the screen or whatever. That is not necessary, but just your experience of being in a certain mood, being in a certain position with your body, having a background feeling of being alive. That is the basis of consciousness. The feedback loops are not necessary. Anyway, that would be my answer.
Professor Fuchs,
yeah,
I've seen two questions from our scholars of this time of this year interdisciplinary study project Body and Bodilessness. Two professors they raised the questions about the embodied robots and what means the embodied cognition. So if you can give your answer to this.
Yeah, could you tell me which ones these are? I have a number of questions still.
Yeah,
there is
PKU Chen Wei. So embodied robots, the question, and then from
embodied robots.
Yes.
Let me see. Could you tell me the name of the person who?
Chen Wei.
Chen Wei. Yeah. Chen Wei.
And the other question is from Wang Kun.
Yeah, I see. I see.
Yeah.
I sympathize with your criticism of functionalism and neuroreductionism. But how do you think about a form of transhumanism in terms of the so-called embodied robots? Are they realistic? Either they are realistic or not. Are they desirable? Well, we would have to clarify what is meant by embodied robots. Robots, in a sense, can be called embodied. Because they obviously consist of a sensory motor organ, of a structure that is movable, that can move, that is regulated through sensory motor feedback loops, and that is, as I said in the example of the spider, of the robot spider, that is even able to reconfigure its own structure, its own movements in reaction to certain changes, either within its own body or within the environment. So this is certainly something that we can call an as-if embodiment, an embodiment not of a subject, that is a body, that experiences itself as a body, and that has a bodily feeling. So that would be the real understanding of embodiment, of the embodied mind. Embodied mind is a subject that is extended in space, just as I pointed out a minute before. You're sitting at in your chair and you have a spatial extension. So you're not in your head, but you're a spatially extended living being. So that is the what I really mean by embodiment or embodied subject. And in that sense, robots obviously are not embodied because there is no embodied experience. But you could call them, you could call this an as-if embodiment, because there are sensory motor loops, there are sensors and actors that are connected to each other, and there's a certain program that creates a functional adaptation of the reaction of the robot, and there may be even a program that leads the robot to do certain things that are functional for other persons, like the example of a cruise missile that I mentioned. The cruise missile is programmed to reach a certain goal, and this program is executed, and it's all quite functional. It's all in place, and the robot can do all kinds of things that we design it to do. But on the other hand, it's certainly not striving for something. It doesn't intend something. It doesn't want something. It doesn't want to be helpful to other people because it has no conscious experience and no feelings. What would be the form of transhumanism that could take embodied robots as a kind of new humans? That is all nonsense. That is all impossible. It's just at best a simulation of what living beings can do. And in that sense, we can imagine better and better robots that can simulate what living beings can do better and better, and that it might even be the case that we create androids that can be hardly distinguished from human beings, but that is another question, because then they would have to we would have to think about how consciousness changes the actions and the behavior of a human being in comparison with a zombie. I don't think that a zombie is possible. I think consciousness changes what a living being does, and therefore an android without consciousness, in my view, would always be in the end distinguishable from a human being. Nevertheless, we can imagine all kinds of simulations of embodiment, of an embodied subjectivity. And if you look at these spiders, for example, they look astonishingly intentional, so to speak, as they try to get up again, as they try to find their stability again when they have been robbed of one leg. One leg has been torn out. It's hard to somehow not to have the impression that it is a wishing animal, because we are used to impute and to empathize with objects that do something seemingly living, that simulate life. We are always ready to feel something into them, so to speak, to feel a kind of empathy for beings which obviously do not deserve empathy because they don't feel anything. But if they behave like a living being would behave, it's very difficult to withhold this empathy, to be aware, to keep aware of the as if. That is what I already pointed out in the movie Her, where the protagonist also gives up the distinction. He's just satisfied with the simulation of being understood, because the human voice is so convincing that he gives up the knowledge, well, that there is no one there actually. So our tendency towards anthropomorphization, our tendency to attribute feelings or tendencies or wishes to inanimate objects should not mislead us to think of these objects as something living, as something conscious. That's a projection. Okay, next question, which I should answer.
Yeah, perhaps the last question of the last question. Have you seen this question about the embodied cognition in your lecture?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I have not much time left now, and only 5 minutes now. But
you can.
It's the last question.
The last question.
Yeah, I'd like to ask a question. Yeah. How to understand embodied cognition in your lecture? As is known to us, soul's embodiedness could be reduced to a brain. However, I can see that in your embodied cognition, brain is only a relational organ with its resonance to body environment, etc. Well, that's the question about the term embodied cognition. And in Searle's view, the mind could be embrained. So it's just a mind that is in a brain. John Searle even thinks that we could be brain in vats, because we are brain in vats, as he says. Our mind is in our skull. So, and the skull is like a vat. The brain doesn't know anything of the outside world. It's just fueled and fed with information through the senses and through the limbs, and it is actually a brain in a vat. And therefore his mind is embrained and not embodied. Well, I can only repeat that this idea is mistaken, because it blinds out, it doesn't see the intimate connection between the brain and the whole body through constant feedback loops that are not that are biochemical, that are humoral, and that are not only information loops that could be separated from the body. So the feeling of how the body of the body's state is not something that could be simulated by a brain in a vat, because the brain is so inherently interconnected with this whole state of the organism that no supercomputer or no data transmission could simulate or could represent the body as it is could represent the body in the brain. So I cannot go into further detail here, but the question is about the kind of interconnection between the brain and the body as a whole. And this interconnection is not just one of informatory or information feedback loops. It is a much more physical, biochemical relation of constant exchange of matter and of of signals that cannot be separated into the body on the one hand and the representation of the body in the brain on the other hand. So our consciousness is the integral, is the integration of the whole state of the body, and not not a representation of the body in the brain. That would be my answer to the last question. And now I'm sorry I have to finish this nice interaction, and I thank you very much for your questions.
Yeah, our time is up. Thank you.
Our time is up. I'm ready to answer further questions. If you like, you could just write me emails, and I can also send you the slides. We can interact further in by emails or by in the digital way, so to speak. But we have to conclude the session now, I'm afraid.
Your email of your university, can we write email to you? Yeah.
Yes,
good.
Exactly.
Good.
Yeah.
I would like to thank each of you for being here and all your good questions. And I would like to thank, of course, Professor Fuchs for your wonderful lecture and your answers, all your answers. Our third lecture by Professor Liang will take on place on November 26th. Come on and join us if you are interested. Please register with the Institute of Sino-Christian Studies. Bye-bye and auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen. Auf Wiedersehen. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.